Last class, huh? One of those days. Last class, huh? Yes. Better. Yeah, it's hard to believe every semester flies by quicker than the previous one. You all go on to second year and third year, and I stay here. But it's a pleasure so far. In terms of meetings, I've met with all of you now. Every single one. If you didn't, that's your fault. Some of you missed your appointments, but I made appointments for everyone else. There's no class on Thursday. Your review session will be on the 7th of December at noon. Probably in this room. It might change, but I'm pretty sure I have this room reserved. Do you know what they actually do when there's an exam that evening? They lock in the room like 6 hours in advance to make people don't cheat, right? I'm serious, I didn't know this until recently. Students apparently will sneak into a room and tape stuff under the desk, and then they sit in that seat when I had no idea. So apparently they actually lock down the room the entire day of the exam. I only learned this recently. So as long as there's no exam in this room that evening, I think you're okay. Any questions, anything in your minds? Anything in your minds? Very last day of class, anything about takings, regulatory takings, anything in your minds? No? Okay, move on. Alright, so you should be signed in by now. Okay. Last attendance, huh? Let's start off with this question. See what happens on this one. And obviously we have only one case for our last day, so we've already spent a lot of time on the kilo. Okay. Here's your question. The City of New London used the power of eminent domain to take Susan Kilos home in order to provide a benefit for Pfizer. Benefit for Pfizer. The City of New London used the power of eminent domain to take Susan Kilos home in order to provide a benefit for Pfizer. That's your question. Good. 15 more seconds. Who's next? Alright, what's your answer here, my friend?
Well, I put true, but now the more I'm thinking about it, I'm kind of thinking it might be false.
Oh, come on, you have 40 seconds. Think about it. Is that not enough time? Well, give me the soliloquy, right? Give me your internal conflict, your turmoil. What's giving you angst?
Well, they took the land for the public benefit to create more jobs and stuff, but Pfizer benefited from that also. But I don't know if that was actually the intent was solely to benefit that specific company.
Kayla, what's your thinking here?
That was kind of what I was thinking too. I put true, but then I was like, well, I mean, it did benefit Pfizer, but it was bringing jobs and everything.
So you have people on the fence, huh? Simone, what's your thinking here?
I am definitely on the fence too.
You're definitely on the fence.
They did take her home, and it was because they wanted, Pfizer could bring in more taxes than she could, but at the same time, they didn't even end up using the land whenever they took it, so I don't even think they really benefited anything.
Alright, Chester, what's your take?
I put false.
Okay.
Because, although Pfizer was part of the private community, the ultimate goal was for the public. So
Public benefit, right? So here we have 4 people, it's 3 on 1, right? Or at least maybe people on the fence. So Yusuf, here's my question for you. If these 3 or 4 people are somewhat on the fence that can't decide, how's the court to decide what the purpose was behind this exercise of eminent domain? If these 3 people, 4 people, they can't agree amongst themselves, how's the court to decide?
That's the issue. I think
Wise guy.
Well, they need to use the power of eminent domain to publish use. That's what the issue was.
Right.
And some of the dissents were saying about that they use the public purpose rather than public use, as they were reselling it to another private organization, company.
All right, very good. So you said hit the issue on the head. That's more or less what I'm getting at, right? The Fifth Amendment, right? The Takings Clause. The language used is this. It says, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. If you were in my common law class, you don't get a constitution. I don't give Madam Property. Maybe I should, but it's right there in the Fifth Amendment. Okay. How do you decide what a public use is? And this was what my question was getting at over here. Was the purpose of the law to benefit Pfizer? Was the purpose of the law to benefit the public? Was it 90% Pfizer, 10% public? Was it 50-50? What was the use of the land? Would it be used for the public, or would it be used for Pfizer? Is there a difference between public use, which is what the language the Constitution says, and public purpose, which is the language Justice Stevens uses over and over again? Right? What's the difference between public use and public purpose? Okay, everyone get the general frame of this case. So, the reason why I stick this case at the very end, because it's at once the easiest takings case we'll have all semester, right? All of our takings cases so far have been really hard, involving raisins and involving beachfront property and skyscrapers, right? Is it a taking? Is it not? There's no doubt that they are taking Susan Kilo's home, right? There's no doubt at all about it. They're going to demolish it with a bulldozer, right? They're taking her house, no questions asked. There is no doubt they're providing compensation. Whether it's just or not, maybe we'll get to later. I don't want to focus too much on that. They're going to pay for it, right? They're going to pay for it. They're going to take the property. The question is this taking for public use? And that's the nature of the question today. Is it for public use? Or is it for something else? Is it for private use, private development, whatever other words you want to use? Okay? So the nature of our class today is not about whether it's a taking or even whether the compensation is provided. There was compensation provided. It's whether public use was at issue. All right? So let me give you a little bit of background about this case. It's one of the most unpopular decisions in recent memory. And one of the reasons why it's so unpopular is that the reaction doesn't break down along traditional conservative and liberal lines. This is a decision that Al Sharpton and Rush Limbaugh both condemned. And it doesn't happen very often. There was a very widespread reaction to this case across the political spectrum. So let's go through our facts here. I'll call people in a minute. Let me run you through this first. So this was Susan Kilo, and this was her little pink house. In fact, there's actually a movie being made about this. I hope it's not terrible. I really do. Apparently, I think Brooke Shields is going to be Susan. No, not what's her name? Catherine Kinnan. Catherine Kinnan, right? It's an actress. Anyway, someone IMDb it. I'm pretty sure I'm right. But there's a movie coming out about Kilo. I hope it's not terrible. Usually, movies about courts are usually awful. They usually mess it up. I get very angry. I start yelling at the screen. I really do. Did anyone see the movie Women in Gold? Yes. Ryan Reynolds? Did you remember the Supreme Court scene? There was a fan on the bench. There's no fan in the Supreme Court. The guy playing Breyer had a little fan next to him. There's no fan there. Why would you do that? Was it hot? Did you need a fan? Anyway, I was actually yelling at the screen. It was an empty theater, but I got very angry. No wonder no one takes me out. Anyway, I show as much restraint in theater as I do here, which is not much. But this is Susan Kilo, and you see here it says "House Not for Sale." It's hard to make out that sign. And this was her little pink house in New London, Connecticut. New London was a fairly economically depressed town. It was formerly the site of a shipbuilding and Coast Guard and other things, and all that stuff moved away. So the town became pretty bad condition. This is what Suzette Kilo's block looks like today. It's an empty lot. There's one little building though in the corner. On the corner. Does anyone know what that one little building left in the corner is? Yeah, Rob?
The Italian men's club?
Yeah, the Italian Dramatic Club, yeah. I'll do the follow, Robert. Why is the entire block vacant except for this little building on the corner, little parking lot?
Because this guy was like a twin soprano or something, and he was really connected.
Oh, you're good Canadian, yes, since you know. He was Italian, you know that, right?
Yeah. And connected.
Well, the reason why the Italian Dramatic Club was not seized is that it was, yes, Robert, thank you, well connected. I won't say what you're saying, but it was well connected. So there's a guy named Valentini who ran the Italian Dramatic Club. It was a men's club, which was a couple blocks from Suzette Kilo's home. And he called this guy Levin, who was a frequent visitor to the club. And he demanded that his club would not be touched. And there was a letter written. It said, "It is an absolute and complete understanding that the club will not be touched by anyone." Here's the verbatim quote from the letter. "Anyone who says otherwise is lying to a member of the club, and I will confront that person personally who is spreading the rumor." That's actually a legit letter, it's in the record. So basically, the entire block was cited or located for eminent domain, except for this one house in the corner. And I think Robert said the issue well. The club was exempted because they had fairly strong political connections and otherwise. Now, what's my experience in this lot? So a couple years ago, I went to a conference at Yale, which is in New Haven, Connecticut, which is about 2.5 hours from New London. So what the hell? I had a few hours free. I said, let me drive out there. I would love to show you pictures of it, but I can't. Let me finish the story. So I drove out there, and this was back in 2013 or so. I had my camcorder, right? Back then, 5 years ago, you still had a video camera. It was digital, don't worry. And I drove to the lot. I was driving around, and I made a wrong turn near Suzette Kilo's lot. And I inadvertently turned into the parking lot of General Dynamics. General Dynamics is a military contractor. So I pull in there, and I just made a wrong turn. And I'm this schmuck with my hand out the window, recording on my video camera in the parking lot of a military contractor. So, I don't know, this Jeep pulls in front of me. I'm like, oh crap. And this huge guy pulls out. I'm like, oh god, I'm getting arrested. And he gets up and he basically blocks my car so I couldn't move anywhere. And he had a siren. I'm like, oh god, this is not good. So I asked him, what's going on? He's like, what are you doing? I said, I'm recording the site of the Kilo house for my property students. He looked at me, he didn't have a clue what the hell I was talking about. He said, what are you doing? And I'm like, look, I'm recording videos for my students. And he had no idea. He said, give me your license. And I thought, okay, I'm getting arrested for trespassing. He had my license for 15 minutes. I don't know if he Googled me or whatever. But he came back and I said, look, I'll tell you what, I will give you my camera, I'll delete all the footage I have, and you can let me go. And eventually he said, fine. So I almost got arrested for my dear property students taking a video of the Kilo house. But it doesn't stop there. So eventually he let me go. I had to delete all my footage. So then I pull over a few blocks, and I'm like, oh, I got an idea. Let me pull into the parking lot of the Italian Dramatic Club and get some pictures there. It was Sunday morning. So, Robert, what do you think happened?
Get in trouble.
These two big pickup trucks pulled up also. The Mr. Tony Soprano, right? And so I get the hell there really quick. I just zip out of there. I'm like, I'm not doing this crap again. So I was actually about to start taking pictures of the Dramatic Club, and these two guys pull out and I'm like, I'm not doing this. What are you doing here, right? So eventually I got around, but I did get some pictures of the Kilo lot itself. And it's hard to convey the scale, but this is like a humongous block. I mean, this block is basically the size of this entire school campus. It's a pretty big block. You can't really tell from the air. This is more or less what it looks like. This is the General Dynamics contract. So he goes right across the street. To this date, 2017, the lot is still vacant in New London, Connecticut. The only occupants are feral cats. You know, there's little cats that run around and they do whatever cats do. But there's no development there. And you think, Josh, wait a minute, where's Pfizer, right? Why did Pfizer not build their job magnet? Well, the reason why is a couple of years after this case wound its way, Pfizer engaged in a merger with Wyeth, another pharmaceutical company. And Wyeth had a lot of real estate not too far away. So Pfizer just backed out and said, yeah, you know what, never mind, we're not going to build anything here. So, after all of this was said and done, you know, this litigation went on for years and years and years, nothing was built. The government owns this vacant lot. They have no intent on building on it. What happened to Sousa Kilo's home? Well, it's not there anymore, but they actually paid to have it moved. They actually took it apart plank by plank, and they moved it a couple miles. I didn't know you could do this, apparently. But they took it apart plank by plank, and they rebuilt it about 2 or 3 miles away. And it's now called the Kilo House, and I actually visited there as well. I just got in trouble again. I was taking pictures. Apparently, Suzette doesn't live there anymore. Someone else lives there, but there's a covenant that they keep it pink. So I pull up there and start taking pictures, and I'm like, that doesn't get in trouble, so I pulled away. But the point is, after this entire sensing pattern here, the restraining part lacking, after this entire episode, Suzette Kilo's home was moved maybe about a mile or 2 away. The lot is empty. So it's very easy in hindsight to just criticize Justice Stevens' opinion, saying, look, this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He authorized this taking, right? Nothing came of it. There was no public benefit at all, right? The only thing that happened was Kilo lost her home, right? It's easy enough to say that. But the question you have to confront yourself is, in 2005, with what was known then, was this decision a correct interpretation of constitutional law? Or, more precisely, was this decision a correct application of precedents stretching back some decades, right? So it's really easy to criticize this case by saying, oh, look, nothing was built there, vacant lot, right? But, you know, hindsight's always 20/20. So any questions on that? I nearly got arrested 3 times in a day. Yeah, Jesse.
Is this by jurisdiction, or is there a rule concerning adverse possession of land that's been taken for eminent domain but hasn't been utilized? Like, let's say the feral cats could talk and they, you know.
Are you trying to think of an exam question? The cats can talk? Is this like?
That sounds like an exam question.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I don't think cats can claim adverse possession, but you're saying could a squatter get the land back?
Yeah.
Is that what your question is?
That's been taken.
So the rules on adverse possession against the government vary by jurisdiction. I don't remember what Connecticut's rule is. You can probably Google that. I know in New York you can squat against the government in certain contexts. I don't know about Connecticut. But in theory, yes, if Suzette Kilo set up camp and basically built a house there, kept it there for a decade, whatever the period is, in theory, I suppose you can get it back.
It'd be the same rules as if it wasn't government.
Well, the rules for squatting against the government are a little bit different. Some jurisdictions just don't allow it, period. I don't know. Because you can imagine if you have like a public park and someone basically camps and lives there full time, they don't have basically a right to stay in the park. But I don't know about the vacant lot seized by eminent domain. But hey, if you want to go squat in the Kilo lot, I guess you can go establish a camp.
They're saying they have prescriptive easement in the park?
Well, the other prescriptive easement, if they walk across it, that might be an easier claim to make. But there's really nothing there. You wouldn't want it. It's pretty vacant. Is that okay? All right. So let me also give you some history on various cases. And we've talked about some of these cases, but I want to piece it together for you for a chronology. The first case, which I don't think we've mentioned but was discussed in the opinions, is Calder v. Bull, which is a case back in 1790 something. Check me on the year. And this was a case that established the rule that a law that takes from A and gives to B is void, right? You can't have a law that merely takes from A and gives to B, right? That's not a valid use of the government's power. That's a fairly basic principle that I think everyone agrees upon, which is why when I framed the question here, the city of New London used the power to take Kilo's home to provide a benefit for Pfizer. As usual, my framing is deliberate, right? If this was merely taking Kilo's house to give it to Pfizer straight up, direct, that will be not a public purpose, right? But I framed it a little bit different. I had to provide a benefit for it, and that was not accidental. So the question here is, how much of this is about benefiting Pfizer, and how much of this is actually about benefiting the public as a whole? So we have Calder v. Bull. Another case which we've discussed is Buchanan v. Worley. Right? This was a case involving racial segregation in Louisville, Kentucky, where you had certain blocks that were designated for African Americans to live on, and certain blocks for white people to live on, and you couldn't sell a house to opposite race people. It was illegal. Okay? The court struck that down as a violation of the due process clause. That this violated property interest and liberty interest protected by the 14th Amendment. That people have a right to contract, they can sell their house whenever they wish. Okay, so it's Buchanan. Then we get to our favorite case, Village of Euclid, the Ambler. And this was a case that established the power of the government to zone, right? You have residential zoning, you have commercial zoning, you have different types of land use. And Village of Euclid chopped up all these parcels and said, you can do that. That does not deprive people of their property without due process of law. Okay? Then we go to another case which we haven't studied yet. Shelley V Kraemer. Oh no, we did Shelley, I'm sorry. Shelley V Kraemer. This is about racial covenants. And the court said that a racial covenant cannot be enforced in court because you're actually asking the courts to employ something that violates the 14th Amendment. Right? So these are the big cases involving land use. I'm getting somewhere in a moment, I promise. The next case is called Berman V Parker, 1954. This was a case referenced at some length in the reading today. And Berman V Parker considered whether the District of Columbia could use the power of eminent domain to seize basically an entire area of the district. Right? Now, some of it was blighted. What does blighted mean? In very bad condition. Other parts of this lot were not blighted. So you had the owner, I think, of a hardware store in D.C. whose business was profitable, in good shape. He said, hey, why are you taking my property, right? My business is just fine. Okay? Go take someone else's property, not mine. The Supreme Court, in an opinion by Justice Douglas, upheld the taking in Berman. And what Justice Douglas said is the government has a broad power to make things beautiful and pretty. Right? Remember Pig in the Parlor, right? They can control how things appear. And if the government decides that you need to take the entire block and not just individual parcels that are blighted, they can do that. So once you get to Berman, the court starts reading the takings clause in a different fashion, right? It's not so much about public use, right? About whether the public will use this property, but whether the taking itself serves a broader public purpose of redevelopment and renourishment and improving the economic base of the area. So Berman is an important case where the court begins to turn in a different direction. Okay? Then we get to the 1980s with Hawaii Housing Authority versus Midkiff. The facts of this case are actually a little bit tricky, but I'll explain it as best as I can. Hawaii is a series of islands. Dumb, right? One of the aspects of having islands is there's very little property. As it turned out, Hawaii, almost all the land on certain islands was owned by the government, state and federal. So the ownership of private property was concentrated in very few firms and families. It's what you call an oligopoly, right? A few people on the island owned basically almost all the land. There was very little fee simple ownership. Virtually everyone had a leasehold. So the government had this genius idea. They said, aha, we are going to break up the oligopoly. And if you have one of these monopolistic holdings, we're just going to break it up. We're going to use the power of eminent domain to seize your property and give it to the person who's renting it from you. We'll pay you for your land. We're going to chop it up from you. Okay? The court upheld this in an opinion by Justice O'Connor. Now, note, Justice O'Connor dissented in Kelo. Awkward for her, right? She may have realized she was wrong, I don't quite know. We'll never get to know for sure. But O'Connor dissented in Kelo. But back in the 80s, she was cool with it. And she wrote in the Midkiff case that the government's interest in breaking up this oligopoly, this ownership of land by a few people, was a public purpose. And therefore, the state can use this. So the question then becomes this. Is Kelo, right, the next line in the case, right, is Kelo consistent with Berman and Midkiff, right? If the court's already held that promoting various public purposes is a legitimate basis to act, is there any difference between those old cases and Kelo? We'll get there. All right, so everyone with me on the facts so far, or the basis. There's a big wind up to this case because there's a lot of moving parts here. All right, want to give me the facts?
Yeah, so the City of New London created a development plan to sort of revitalize the area we've been talking about. Their plan kind of centered upon Pfizer coming in and setting up their facilities there. And there was a bond passed by the state. Well, they already, we talked about like gone into dismay and stuff. And so there was a bond by the state to come in and using that domain to purchase property from people that live there.
Okay. Now, how did they decide to take these specific parts of the property? Why these lots? Is there anything in the case tells you that?
Well, they had it was by the waterfront.
Okay, good. By the water. Was it random they decided to take the waterfront properties?
They wanted to put in a Coast Guard museum.
No, I know that, but was it random? Was there any sort of reason why they chose this lot over others?
That's an important point. It was attractive place to put it.
Was it attractive, John Paul? Why did the New London Development Corporation choose this lot over that lot? Well, no, that's why they chose the City of New London. What guidance or what process did they use to select this lot? Was it random? Was it arbitrary? Did they just do it in the spur of the moment? Anthony, not in the right spot, but I can call on you.
I don't really know.
Anyone know what I'm talking about?
If it was arbitrary, they would have struck it down, right? So they had to have some kind of reason.
That's good, Robert.
I think they chose it because one, the water, Pfizer wanted a nice little office in the water, which was said, but also it's a low income area, like Kilo's house was in this area. They wanted to gentrify
Get rid of the Tony Sopranos, right? That's not what I'm looking for. It's correct, but not what I'm looking for. Yeah?
Is it because they did the whole city planning?
Plan. There's the key word, plan, right? So they said there was a comprehensive and ambitious plan. Okay? The majority made a lot, I'll go back to John Paul. The majority made a very big deal about the fact that this really detailed plan, right? Why was this plan such a big deal? Why did it put so much attention on this majority?
Because it established that the idea of the benefits of the Pfizer.
Good. Did the plan say we are doing this to benefit Pfizer? Right. Anthony, I think you actually answered it a minute ago. What did the plan say? I mean, you don't just read the plan. What do you think the plan said?
The plan was for the redevelopment and reinvigoration of the community.
Right. So here we have the situation, right? The government comes to court and says we are going to use the power of eminent domain to seize these properties for the purpose of improving our community, right? We'll increase the tax base. We'll bring back jobs, right? We're going to do these awesome things. I promise you, it says nowhere, we are doing this to help out Pfizer, right? That phrase will appear nowhere, right? It's not going to be mentioned that Pfizer gave the New London Development Corporation a $150,000 loan. That happened, right? That's not going to be in the plan. But the important point is, when the government takes certain actions, right, generally you presume they're acting in a regular fashion, right? The government says, we are taking this land for the benefit of our community. Courts generally aren't in the business of second guessing them. That's why so much attention is put on the plan. Now, Justin, what's a sham? What's pretense, right?
A sham, just kind of like, you know, we're saying this even though, I mean, it's basically if they were basically stating what they need to state, like that it's for public use, even though like underneath all of that is specifically for Pfizer. We just wanted to make it look like it's to benefit.
How do you know, Justin, let me ask you a follow-up, please. How do you know if the plan, I mean, this is an ambitious plan right here, is the real reason or is the pretext, the fake reason? How are we supposed to know?
I don't really think you can until it plays out.
Well, we got an empty lot there 15 years later, right? Elena, how is it supposed to know if something's a sham or a pretext?
Well, I guess if the plan was sufficient in control, they include statistics of how much money we're going to bring into the community and the jobs that we can create. The more specific they are, I think the less of a sham.
So the more ambitious, more specific, more detailed the plan is, it can't be a sham.
Or maybe where money's coming from versus where the money's planning to go. You can specifically trace the money.
So now, let me ask you this question. If the goal is to just make a very complicated and long plan, is that hard to cover up what's really going on here? Or maybe what's not going on? Maybe in fact, this was about economic revitalization.
I don't think it'd be very hard to make a very detailed plan, but I think it was kind of, I don't know, to me it was clear that they were trying to do something good.
So you think this was not a sham or pretext?
I mean, I think there may have been a little bit of a motivation to it, but I think at the end of the day they were just trying to get a better place.
And then how do you explain the dramatic club, our favorite?
Yeah, that seems
Sketchy, yeah. Robert, what do you think? How does the court determine if there's a pretext or if it's a real purpose behind the law? Can the court determine, right? I mean, do we have to psychoanalyze the people on this committee, put them under a lie detector test, put them under like, a brain scanner? I mean, how can you even know this? How can you know what a person's purpose is?
I'm not sure, but I remember reading that they said they give them, I guess, but they said that they give them the benefit of the doubt, basically. I think it seemed like that's what they were saying.
Do the dissenters think this is a pretext, that's a sham? Do they say that?
They said that there is no clear and convincing evidence that economic benefits would in fact come to pass.
But will, right? So let's just be careful here, right? No one, even in the dissent, is saying that this is a pretext. What they're saying is it wasn't specific enough, right? What the dissent says is there's no indication this will actually come to pass. Indeed, 10 years later, the thing's still empty. So, William, does the government need to say with certainty that this sort of economic development will happen?
Well, not really. I think they just have to show that it's reasonably foreseeable.
Ah, okay. So that's actually the difference between the majority and the dissent. The majority said so long as it's reasonable that these benefits may pertain, they can take it. The dissent says, no. You got to show us some specificity, right? Is there any evidence this will actually happen? These amazing economic benefits. Okay, so that's one part of the difference between the majority and the dissent, right? The purpose is the pretext. But the more important part, is this actually a public use? Right? That's the big debate between the majority and the dissent. Is this actually public use? Here they divide very sharply. So Kaylee, is this taking of Kilo's home a public use?
Yeah.
Okay, why?
Because it will essentially financially benefit the public, or at least that's what it ultimately on to.
Incidentally agrees with, say this again.
It will incidentally benefit, so
the primary purpose isn't to benefit Pfizer or any other private party. Well, even if it were, if it incidentally benefits, so as a secondary effect
Good.
of the taking, if it benefits the public in some way, then it's
So what does the phrase public use mean, Kayla? Just by itself, public use.
just by itself, either that the government uses it or that they let the public use it.
Okay, so I mean, just as a matter of language, the phrase public use would suggest that it's used by the public, right? I mean, that seems pretty straightforward, right? Matt, is the land that's being condemned by Kilo something that can be used by the public? I mean, is Kilo's land? But when I say condemned, the word condemned means the government takes it, right? That's just what condemned means. So when the government condemns Kilo's home, will that land be used by the public?
It was supposed to.
It was supposed to?
Wasn't it part of one of the parcels that they had in their plan?
What was a part of it?
What parcel was it in?
What part of it was used by the public?
Ultimately, like what actually happened?
According to the plan. According to the plan, was this supposed to be used for the public, this land? In other words, could I just stroll into Pfizer's headquarters and have lunch there?
Oh, no.
No, I can't, right? Could I just walk around their parking lot and just park my car there?
Mm-hmm.
Could I, chill in the streets nearby and, just hang out there?
Probably not very long.
No, I almost got arrested for doing it across the street, right? So is this for public use?
Not directly.
Okay, so Cody, let's look at our past example, right? And let's address the question. Does this case follow necessarily from Berman V Parker and White Housing Authority of Michigan? So I told you in Berman V Parker, they said we are going to take all this property to build public housing, right? Is that for the public use?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's directly beneficial to the public. It's not indirectly.
Does everyone in the public get to use that housing?
Well, I suppose in theory they could.
Alright. Well, can everyone live in a public unit apartment? Does everyone get it?
Yeah. If I'm understanding your question correctly, yes.
So an unlimited number of people, anyone who walks on the street will live in a public unit?
I think so. In theory, anybody could.
But what if it's already occupied? Can I live in that unit?
Oh, no.
Ah. So usually public use, in at least the 1800s, meant something that could be used by the public. A park, right? Anyone can walk into a park. A railroad, right? Anyone can use a railroad, a common carrier. A school, anyone can go to school. Hospitals pushing it, but generally people can go to a hospital, right? Government building, a courthouse, right? Anyone can walk into a courthouse. But in the 1950s, you started taking a different shift, right? It wasn't using it for public access for everyone, a park or a railroad or a highway, right? Everyone can use a highway, common carrier. They used it for something that was in the public spirit, perhaps, right? Public housing for low-income individuals. But it wasn't used by the general public, right? So Virginia, going to the next case, right? The Hawaii Housing Authority in Michigan. This is where they took all the fee simple property from the oligopolists and they gave it to the middling leaseholders, right? Was that in the public use?
No, it's for public purpose.
Purpose, what's the difference?
So public use is you're allowing the public to use the land like a park. The public purpose is where you're trying to benefit the public as a whole. So you're trying to raise the economic development or something like that, like raise taxes. So
Okay.
you're trying to benefit the public.
Right. So in the Hawaii case, it was still arguably public purpose. Because I can't just walk into someone's house in Honolulu and say, hey, what's up? I want to hang out here. They'll kick me out. But it was not giving it to any sort of private party. It was giving it just generally to the people who live there. Right? It wasn't trying to favor any one party. Okay? So does Kilo follow naturally from Hawaii Housing Authority and Berman V Parker? Probably yes. But there's a difference here, right? At least with public housing and the oligopoly, they were trying to address a problem that the public suffered at large, right? If these neighborhoods are blighted, everyone's suffering because of a blighted neighborhood. If there's an oligopoly, everyone's suffering because there's not enough fee simple property available, right? But essay, was anyone suffering because of Suzette Kilo's house? Was her house blighted? Was there any indication it was in bad condition?
Not Kilo's, no.
No, it wasn't. So what was the problem they were trying to solve? Did it anything to do with Kilo?
They just needed that property
For
their redevelopment, for their.
yeah. So this is, I think, you know, I go back and forth in this case, but I think the big difference between Berman and Hawaii Housing Authority is that in those cases, the thing they were taking was the problem, right? They were taking the blighted property in Berman. They were taking the oligopoly apart, right? The thing that was the problem was the subject of the eminent domain. Here, Kilo's home was not the subject of the problem. She just merely was conducive to that solution, right? Her house wasn't blighted. Her house wasn't creating any sort of market distortions. So I think you can distinguish Hawaii Housing Authority and Berman from Kilo. It's not a very good distinction. So O'Connor is not totally on her own here. But it would be much better if she didn't write that opinion 20 years earlier. Okay? Simple with me so far. Now, Robert, let me ask you the next question. The petitioners in this case, the lawyers representing Kilo, it's a nonprofit group called the Institute for Justice. They're a pretty good group I've worked with in the past. They wanted to put together a rule that said economic development can never be a public use. Right? Economic development can never be a public use. What does the majority do with this rule? How does the majority treat this rule?
About increasing the tax plan?
Well, does the majority accept the rule that economic development that can never be a public use?
No, they don't.
Why?
Because Justice Stevens says it's so wrong about a city trying to increase their tax base.
Yeah, I think this was Hanan's point before, right? They were trying to do something good, right? The city had been in bad shape for a long time. They've had unemployment, and they thought if we can do this, it will generally improve the public. So the court rejects the line that petitioners draw, but then they adopt a different line, right? The line is public purpose. So long as the taking promotes a public purpose, it's a legitimate governmental interest. Okay? And they don't need to show any sort of reasonable certainty that the thing they're worried about will actually happen, right? They don't need to show any reasonable certainty that indeed the jobs will arise. Okay? Bradley, you're shaking your head very viciously. I don't know, your head might come up its socket, but I don't call you.
I just think it's ridiculous.
Okay, why is it ridiculous?
How far are you going to go, right? If the Constitution says public use, and we know, I mean, we don't know, but I think when they say public use, they mean parks and government, installations and stuff like that. If now you're saying public purpose, then how far does it go for, public purposes? I don't know where it ends.
David?
Yeah, at the same time, there's like, I know that, what do they say, like, before you argue policy, you need to argue like facts and law, but like in the briefs and the oral argument, they make a policy like, you need to draw the line. You need to draw the line. Seeing the trend that happened throughout.
Well, the line that Kilo's lawyer, this is what I asked Robert a moment ago, Kilo's lawyer tried to draw the line saying economic development is always going to be unconstitutional, right? Anytime you take land for purposes of economic development, they argued that would be unconstitutional. Like that was the line that Kilo's lawyer drew. The court rejected that line very firmly. The dissent said, I think Justice Thomas said, public use means public use, right? We'll get to Thomas in a minute. But the majority with Justice Kennedy and the majority didn't need that line. I'll do another hand somewhere. I just put your hand up.
No, but I've got some thoughts.
You can tell me your thoughts then.
I think that Kilo allows the government through pure sophistry to cover up pretty much any seizure can be through clever argument deemed a public purpose. And thus they've transmuted public use and private use so that there is no distinguish whatsoever as long as you're clever enough about how you phrase it.
So what do you mean they're clever enough? Give me a little bit more on that.
I think that if you make an argument, you make a plan, and that plan is convincing enough, and that you can, obviously in this case, this is exactly what happened. They came up with this plan, which clearly is for private use, and somehow made public use pop out of it. So,
yeah, Anna?
I think that even looking at these things, clear benefits that large corporations can bring to the city, and there's only so much local governments can do. And so I think that may change public use to public purpose, but I don't think the fact that there's some kind of mutual benefit to a corporation to the public necessarily means that it's wrong.
Well, they're also, like, let's not forget, just coming up and saying, thanks for your property, have a nice day. They're paying for that property. Maybe they didn't want to move right then, but it's also not just going to kick out their landlord and get foreclosed on without any benefit. I mean, the government has their foot in the right to make sure that we are taken care of and the communities are better. So I think this decision is fair. I see it.
Isn't eminent domain with broad, capabilities prevalent in pretty much every country in the world?
It varies by country. Some have stronger protections for property rights, others have weaker. So I don't know. My property professor wrote a book about internationalist comparison of eminent domain, but I'm not sure of specifics. But the question in this case is how broad does public use stretch? That's our question. Does public use include merely improving benefits? So let's say, David, right? Let's just use Anna's example or Kyle's example, right? Let's say the government just said, look, we have a really economically distressed town. We're just going to give this to Pfizer and let them make some jobs. We're not going to waste our time and spending money on a plan because it's going to be a foregone conclusion. We know what the plan's going to reach. Cut to the chase, right? We're going to use this land and lease it right to Pfizer. What happens then?
Would probably not be.
Why is it not a public purpose, right? Why is it any less of a public purpose than with an ambitious plan? Why is having a plan change the outcome? Why can't they say, look, Pfizer said they're going to open up a job here, open a factory here in 2 years, right? Why are we going to waste 3 years making a plan when they can build a factory in 2 years and be done with it?
Well, if he does that, like, how do we know, even have an idea how it's going to benefit?
Pfizer told us so. We don't need reasonable certainty. Annie, you want to try it?
I'm not saying that I don't think that there should be a plan, but I think drawing this bright line distinction between private use and private benefit and public benefit isn't realistic.
So what the plan just said, Anna, we've determined that Pfizer promises 20,000 jobs in 5 years that they can start right away. And Pfizer told us we want this property because it's nice by the water, we have a nice view for their office front. That's the plan. Is that a public use? Or is that a public purpose?
Well, I think it's not determined in this case that it's public purpose.
That's what I'm asking. So would that be constitutional? That's all the plan says. That Pfizer promised us 20,000 jobs in 5 years, and they want waterfront property, so we're going to let it happen here with them. Take the land, the kilo, and just sell it to them.
I agree with that.
Okay, Chester?
We just said we can't take and give to anybody.
Well, I did say that, didn't I? So, but why? Why is that the rule? I said it. Why is that the rule? If public purpose means what the court says, why can't you just transfer it straight up? Right? Why is that a limiting principle?
Because the court says you're consistent with the plan, and you make your decisions based on the life of the whole plan. And you can say, I can commit 20,000 jobs at the end of the day. That's a public purpose.
So if the plan says we're just going to give this straight up to Pfizer and let them make some jobs, why is that unconstitutional? In other words, why do you draw any line, right? Where do you get this line you can't take and give to B? If that creates jobs and you know that they're going to help the community, why can't you just give to Pfizer straight up?
Because I know that.
One more example, please. Yeah.
I mean, I think the compensation is part of it.
Oh, they get compensated for, but I'm talking about public use, right? I'm not talking about compensation. If all the plan says is, we've determined that Pfizer will create 20,000 jobs, they want waterfront property, therefore we give them to this house. that a public use? Yeah.
Well, in the plan, they state whether it's, like we were talking about earlier, sham or not, what how it benefits the public in general. If you just give it to Pfizer, they may do whatever they want with it.
No. They say we are giving to Pfizer because they promised to create 20,000 jobs. That's what it says right there. And if they're having a factory in this town, people have to work there, don't they? They have to go shop at the restaurants, live nearby. There's no doubt. In other words, why is this principle, you can't take from A and give to B, a rule? That's my question. Why can't you just take from A and give to B? What's the problem with that, Anthony?
The possibility of abuse. We have representative government CEOs or employees of Pfizer can all be on city council and start taking land from whoever they want to.
What happened here?
They took their land.
In other words, why can't you have this abuse if we just defer to the government? Let the corporation make jobs, right? Make America great again, right? Why can't we just have that, right? But
Oh, I wasn't actually raising my hand, but I will say, it is. It's completely arbitrary. And like what Sin says is, nearly any lawful use of real private property can be said to generate some incidental benefit to the public. You can, like Isaac said, just if you paint it the right way, then you can basically do anything you want.
Yeah.
And if it works so well for the public, then now it's a vacant lot. It's like that sentence, classic saying, worst sentence you can ever hear in your life is we're the government, we're here to help.
Jessica?
I believe the government would argue having this plan, not including the word Pfizer, saying we're taking the land and we determine Pfizer is giving that public use, they're going to say it's different than saying we're giving this from A to B.
What's the difference?
The difference is that the land being given to B is based on their comprehensive plan that isn't to give to a private party but to benefit society, they'll claim, while giving it A to B is to benefit Pfizer.
But they're giving it to B to make jobs, right? If Pfizer's there, the factory's not going to be empty. They're going to have to employ people, right? I'm pushing you all this for a reason, right? You could agree with the majority or not. Frankly, I don't care. But why do you draw the line between A to B, right? Why is that to bridge too far? In other words, let's just say you have the exact same plan, right? Let's say we want to take this oceanfront property so someone can develop a pharmaceutical facility to employ 5,000 people. You don't say Pfizer in there, but everyone in the world knows that the only pharmaceutical company that's going to build there would be Pfizer, right? They have to make Viagra, so Bob Dole can, make commercials. Too soon? Yeah. But does it make a difference if you actually mention Pfizer in the plan? Bradley?
I guess it's just a stopgate to try and slow things down and make sure that it's for a legitimate public purpose, even though the end result probably isn't, in my opinion at least.
Yeah?
Is it like, if you didn't actually have a plan to say we're going to give it to Pfizer, couldn't the government just take the land and hold it for God knows how long? And it's like...
Oh, that's actually what they did here. They're holding it for God knows how long.
Yeah, but well, I don't know, it's like this happened to me. It's like what you're saying. I just thought of even before there's even definite plans, we're just going to start, before there's any definite plans and any actual contracts or whatever, the government could just take the land.
Demolish it if they want to make a park, right? What if, let's use David's question, what if they just demolish land and say, we want to make a park here? And then after they make the park, we change our mind. It's not a good place for a park. Let's build an office complex instead. Oh, but the land was already taken. Can you undo a taking at that point?
No.
No one else in the majority. Alright, so the majority, and I'm pushing on this for a reason, what the majority basically says is a few things. First, deference, right? They are going to give deference to plans for eminent domain. They're not going to second guess them. Right? They're not going to second guess where they need to take property, how much they need to take it. The second question for the majority is, what's a public use? They say it means public purpose. Now, so long as something benefits the public at large, it can be taken. Even if the thing that's being taken is not itself problematic. Kilo's home is not blighted. Kilo's home doesn't impose any market distortions. Kilo's home is lawful. and she's not bothering anyone. Okay. Now, Mark, at the very end of Stevens' opinion, like the very last paragraph or two, he says that, you know, this case is not the end of the situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happens if people don't like the Kelo decision? What can happen?
They said, and the notes even corroborated this, that they can bring it to the legislature to change rules.
What do you mean they can change the rules?
Well, this isn't a court decision. I mean, the court has to act based off of statutes and the Constitution, the law at hand, but the legislature can enact rules to make it harder for eminent domain processes to work like this.
Can a state legislature amend the federal Constitution?
No.
So
yeah, of course.
Easily?
Not easily.
So what are they doing here short of amending the federal Constitution?
The court is...
What can the states do if they're unhappy with Kelo?
Amend?
Amend what?
Amend their state constitution.
Oh! And what can they amend their state constitutions with?
Provisions against?
Very good. So what Justice Stevens says in dissent is, if the states don't like this, they have options. Every state has their own constitution. And under their state laws, they can provide additional protections for eminent domain. Right? Well, eminent domain is always in state court. It's always a matter of state law. So even if the federal Constitution provides a very weak protection for property rights, the federal Constitution can provide, the state Constitution can provide additional protections. Okay? Now, Amy, you've been in law school now some time. Have you ever seen a court decision where the justice say, if you don't like this, you can go amend your own Constitution? Have you ever seen something like this before? No. Usually what do judges say when they're interpreting the federal Constitution? Do they say you can go change if you don't like it?
No, they usually say this is the Constitution.
Yeah, it's a weird holding. Think of any other case where the court interprets, Second Amendment or abortion or affirmative action, whatever else. What? Usually the court says, okay, here's our ruling, now live with it, right? You doesn't say, well, if you don't like our ruling, you can make other rules on top of it. It's almost a recognition that the majority realizes this is going to be very unpopular and people aren't going to be happy with this. So let's just blame them for this, right? If they want to change the rules, they can change the rules. They're empowered to do this. Indeed, this case was very unpopular. There was actually a movement a couple of years after Kelo to seize Justice Souter's house using eminent domain. He has a barn up in New Hampshire somewhere, and they wanted to use eminent domain to seize his house and turn it into a museum about eminent domain. Didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. I thought that would have been funny if it did. But that didn't go too far. But the second part of Stevens' conclusion did happen. A number of states did enact amendments to their state laws to try to provide additional protections for property rights. Unfortunately, most of these amendments weren't very good. So, for example, Texas enacted one in 2009 called Amendment 11. So there's good and there's bad. So the Texas Amendment does forbid the taking of property for the primary purpose of economic development or enhancement of tax revenues. So the good part is in Texas, under state law, you can't take property purely for economic development. So that's good. The not so good part is it still lets them take property for what's called urban blight. Okay? Now, the definition of blight in Texas is so broad that basically any property the government wants to seize can be deemed blighted. Indeed, what can be deemed blighted? Economic or social liability to the municipality, right? So if any neighborhood is deemed to be an economic liability, that is, it doesn't generate enough tax revenue, Texas can deem it blighted. So in other words, nothing changed, right? So the amendment to the Constitution of Texas was changed in 2009. It got rid of private development, you can't have that, but they can deem Susan Kelo's house blighted because it doesn't make enough tax base, and then seize it. So the long and short of it is, even after Texas allowed this amendment to go forward, the laws does not change much. So that's the majority, right? So this effort of letting the state constitutions change, let 1,000 roses bloom, right? Didn't go very far. Okay. Any other questions on the majority? Nothing else on the majority. All right. Who am I up to? Let's talk about Justice Kennedy's concurring opinion. What's going on there?
Well, he wants basically talks about the rational basis test, and that it's basically clear that it's going in favor of private party, that it shouldn't pass the public use standard for incidental benefits to the public.
Right. So Justice Kennedy, whenever he writes a concurring opinion, you should always read it carefully. Because the truth, that's the opinion of the court. Everything else doesn't really matter. He's our supreme overlord. He tells us who lives, who dies, who gets married, who doesn't, who keeps our house, who can't. So he makes all of our tough decisions. It makes it a lot easier for us. Why vote? But here, Kennedy tells us that generally you're implied what looks like rational basis review with eminent domain. Unless, he says, unless there's a narrow category where you apply a more rigorous review. He says private transfers have a risk of undetected favoritism of private parties. Private transfers, he says, are presumed invalid. And when there's a private transfer, there's a demanding level of scrutiny. Okay? Again, he doesn't say why a private transfer is much worse. We don't know what's going on here. But he says, in this case, we're not worrying about it. There's a comprehensive plan. The city complied with the various procedural requirements. And there's not a risk of abuse here. Hilo would probably disagree with that. But Kennedy gave it his fifth vote and his blessing. Okay. So any questions on Kennedy's concurring opinion? No? All right, Stormy, what's O'Connor talking about?
That there's basically like three classes of eminent domain takings that satisfy the public use requirement. And then, do you want me to name?
Yeah, keep going.
Taking property for public ownership, such as for public roads, taking property for use by common carriers like railroads, who put the property to public uses, and then taking property for private ownership in the context of some sort of a public program. And both Midkiff and Berman fell into that third category.
Very good. Very good. So what O'Connor is trying to do here is to provide categories of different types of eminent domain takings, right? So the easiest one is where there's public ownership. A road, a military base, a hospital, park, school, those sorts of things, right? Another category, a second category, involves common carriers, right? We have a railroad, a utility. I question why a stadium is a common carrier. Like, if I go up to Reliance and I say, hey, I want to come inside, they'll charge me a lot of money. I suppose they'll sell anyone a ticket, but I think it's a stretch to call a stadium a common carrier. I don't think they are. But in theory, a railroad, power companies, right? Pipelines in Texas are common carriers. Everyone who wants to put oil through them can get them through. Okay? And then you have this third category, where it's arguably a public purpose. Now O'Connor, again, unlike Thomas, you notice Thomas dissents by himself. He joins this one, but also dissents alone. O'Connor doesn't get rid of the public purpose test. She's okay with that. But she says a public purpose is okay even if it's destined for private use, if you meet certain criteria. So in that sense, the majority and the dissent aren't that far apart. They agree that public purpose is a legitimate definition. They simply disagree about whether New London's plan was a valid public purpose or not. So why does O'Connor think that Berman v. Parker and Midkiff are different? She says in Midkiff and Berman, there actually was a problem. You had blighted property. You had oligopoly that skewed the market. As a result, you defer to those initiatives. Okay? But here, it's a purely private taking, and it serves no legitimate purpose, O'Connor says. Why? Hilo's home is not the source of any social harm. And then she makes what I think is probably the most powerful argument. If the rule in Hilo holds, Tyler, is there anything to stop the government from turning, what she says, a Motel 6 into a Ritz-Carlton, right? Or a home into a shopping mall, or a farm into a factory? Is there anything that prevents merely saying, we think this is not generating enough revenue, we're going to seize this and let it be built for much grander things?
No, the majority gives the government very wide discretion.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's true, there's compensation, right? So you're getting paid. Although, just a note of the compensation, you're not getting everything you want. They don't give you sentimental costs, they don't give you moving costs, inconvenience costs. You're going to lose. They don't pay your attorney's fees, so you're going to lose a lot. So if you try and fight it, you're going to wind up significantly negative. But under the majority's ruling, O'Connor notes, there's really no limit so long as it's part of a comprehensive plan. O'Connor writes, any property may now be taken for the benefit of another party. But the fallout of this decision will not be random. The beneficiaries are likely to be those whose citizens with disproportionate influence and power in the political process, including large corporations and development firms. As for the victims, O'Connor writes, the government now is licensed to transfer property from those with fewer resources to those with more. Delilah, what's she getting at there? What's she talking about right there? At the very end of her opinion.
Likely that somebody that already has, a lot of money to be able to be a part of this plan is eminent domain for the to increase the public harm.
Why are people with more money likely to be able to resist eminent domain? Hold out, or perhaps Tony Soprano, right? Yeah, exactly. What O'Connor's getting at, and also Thomas makes this point a little more forcefully, is that the people who are most likely to be affected by eminent domain are those who are least likely to find it. Right? There's a reason why they demolished everything on the block except for this little club, the Italian club, because they had political connections. And if you actually look at the statistics, the people who are suffering eminent domain are more likely to be poor, uneducated, and minorities. There are numbers I can give them to you, but it's pretty straight up. Why? It's easier to bulldoze their houses. They're less likely to fight it. So the perverse part of this is that it might improve the neighborhood gentrifying, to use Robert's word, perhaps, but this is probably hit hardest people who are least likely to be able to fight it. So any questions on Justice O'Connor's dissent? And want to give us Justice Thomas?
Well, it's similar to this, right?
Okay.
He sticks to an original public purpose, I think.
Okay.
So he, unlike O'Connor, who says that sometimes public use is okay, and then Thomas is that it should only be public purpose.
Yeah, so would Thomas follow Midkiff and Berman at all? Yeah, no, he'll overrule those. Justice Thomas, this is not my common law class, but Justice Thomas has the weakest respect for stare decisis, that is, standing by precedent. He is the justice most likely to revisit all case law, and if he finds that it's not consistent with what he sees as the Constitution's original meaning, he says, let's get rid of it. So Anna's right. Under under Thomas's dissent, he would get rid of public purpose altogether. He would reverse Berman and Midkiff, and say that you can't merely take for public purpose, you need to have a public use. So he would allow, hospitals, highways, right, railroads, parks, schools, and that's about it. Everything else he said would go too far. And he describes the legacy of the public purpose test. And he notes the fact that when you use eminent domain, the people likely to hit are generally poor people. And they're not white. And they're from minority communities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Baltimore, Detroit. And the phrase urban renewal, he says, was a synonym for Negro removal. It was called slum clearance. That was actually how it was called. If you read the comprehensive plans from the 50s, it just used those words, slum clearance, right? So it wasn't too surprising what they were talking about. Thomas writes that the predictable consequences of the court's decision will exacerbate these effects. Okay. All right. So, any other questions on the Thomas dissent? Thomas's dissent. Okay. This is a pretty good place to wind down the semester, I think. We've talked throughout this entire semester how courts should understand land use restrictions, right? And how should courts defer to acts of government? So starting in cases like Euclid, we saw this general sense that the courts would give a lot of deference to the state when they decided how to craft land use. That case said how you use your land. And then we got to cases about regulatory takings. And the general rule there is if the government wants to regulate your land, they can do it. They don't have to pay you for it, unless it meets the nebulous Penn Central test, which basically nothing will ever satisfy. And then our very last day of class, we get all the way to Kilo. And this is beyond whether they can tell you how to use your land or whether you can build or not on it, but whether you can actually keep your property. And once again, the court has demonstrated that they will defer to the government. And when they say defer to the government, that means you rule against the homeowner. Whether this actually improves the outcome in the neighborhood is anyone's guess. Anything else?
Are takings cases not based on whether the government could take it? It's based on whether they have to provide just compensation.
Well, but the threshold to the compensation question is whether, in fact, it's a public use, though. Don't forget that part. Anything else? Thank you all for a great semester. Appreciate it.